Inactive and orphan wells have been a controversial subject in Alberta for a number of years now, and there's a new study out from the School of Public Policy that details some of the issues, and it's a problem. So we're going to talk to Braeden Larson, who was part of the team that wrote that study, and welcome to the interview, Braeden.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of the study, please?
Absolutely. So our paper is meant to identify the costs and burdens that Alberta landowners or the surface rights holders are facing as a result of non-producing oil and gas wells on their land, and how the current governance framework addresses or exacerbates those impacts.
Right, now we should talk about the magnitude of the problem, because I have to tell you, I was even surprised. So we're talking about 97,000 inactive wells, and I think there's 54,000 orphan wells where basically the company's gone insolvent and is
Yes.
not available to clean them up. So is the 54,000 on top of the 97,000?
No, that is included in that number. Orphan wells are included. That number comes from the AER's inactive well list, and that includes orphan wells as well.
Okay, so the orphan wells then, as I understand it, are then become the responsibility of the Orphan Well Association, and it levies a fee to the industry to collect revenue to reclaim those wells. They're used to doing 1,000 or 2,000 a year, and now all of a sudden they have 54,000, and I would imagine the Orphan Well Association is a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's a bit outside of the scope of our paper for how overwhelmed the Orphan Well Association is, but it is the number of wells has become an issue, and it's causing a backup in how long it takes for inactive wells, both by the Orphan Well Association and by private operators, to clean these up. It sometimes takes upwards of 10 years for an inactive well to be properly abandoned and reclaimed.
Well, let's talk about the governance structure. What can you tell us about that?
So currently the governance structure with surface rights is separate from resource rights. And so what we're facing right now is a problem or a potential issue with the province's property rights framework, where the compact between the surface rights holders, the resource rights holders, or the mineral rights holders, and the AER is starting to leave the surface rights holders behind. And so that is just due to the fact that when legislators and legislation was put in place decades ago, that they didn't foresee such a crisis coming up with the amount of liabilities that were appearing.
So now I've interviewed Regan Boychuk from the Alberta Disclosure Project, and he's pretty adamant in his argument that this is a failure. Basically, the industry has been coddled for decades. They've been allowed to accumulate these liabilities. There was nothing in place to make companies, there was no the insurance, there was no deposits. And so this is what we're seeing today is a logical outcome of the ineffectiveness of the liability management system that's been in place for so long. Is that a fair analysis from your point of view?
I would say that in the past, it was the goal of the AER and the government to have more of a lighter touch with industry, with the cleanup of wells. The AER projects that well abandonment costs for any given well can be upwards of $134,000 per well. And so that's a significant cost for a near insolvent company, especially if they are trying to just get by. What we think, there are solutions to that, though, that allow for those companies to still prepare for their liability cleanup. And that could be something as easy as timelines being put in place for well closure, which would allow for companies to start preparing and budgeting for legislated closure activities that they need to do.
So basically, you legislate when a well has to be reclaimed. Maybe it's 2 years or 5 years, whatever it is, after it becomes inactive, and then the company has to budget for it, and that's all there is to it. But what about all the wells that are inactive now and have been abandoned? I mean, from what I hear from Reagan and other people who are involved in this issue, I mean, farmers are stuck with polluted land. They have unsafe well leases on their land. They can't use that land. They're owed money, can't get money. Does your study address any of those issues?
Yes, so the compensation issue is one that's important. We have research that says that some landowners don't get their compensation for rentals that they're owed. Others are getting reduced rentals by the company. That is not a legal practice, but needs to be resolved as well. And then there's also a delay in rentals, and that is due to just the capacity of the Surface Rights Board ability to process how many applications they're getting in a given year. In 2018, which is some of the most recent data that we have for this, they were getting 1,600 applications a year, and it was costing the taxpayer over $6 million to pay these rents, as opposed to 2014 when there was only 200 applications and it was a much smaller amount that was being paid out. So compensation is an issue, and it needs to be resolved through the capacity. And once these wells are properly abandoned and reclaimed, the well has gone through its life cycle, the landowner gets their land back, and they're not, the compensation payments no longer have to go forward, and that helps everybody.
Now, I understand that the AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator, has tinkered with this system a few times in the past, and nobody's really been happy with it. Are there other reforms that are coming up in the near future, and if so, what do they look like?
I'm unsure if there's any reforms coming up in the near future. I'm sorry, that's kind of outside of the scope of what we looked at. We were looking more at the past issues.
Right. Okay. So assume if they are looking at it, and I think that in fact is the case, what recommendations or what suggestions would you have to improve the system?
So the first is obvious, as most of us have said, and I think I've already brought is that we have to address the root cause of the issue for landowners, and that's just resolving Alberta's long-term inactive and unreclaimed oil and gas well inventory. And that can be through timelines, and then it could also be through incentivizing closures or disincentivizing leaving wells open. There's policies available. The second is making changes to the compensation framework to ensure that landowners are compensated fairly and that they're within reasonable time periods. The first is, of course, improving the capacity of the Surface Rights Board to get through more applications quicker, so that people aren't waiting 1 to 2 years for their rents. The other is increasing transparency on compensation rates between companies and landowners so that people know what their land is worth. And then third is just ensuring that landowners are involved in the reform process. We need to make sure that all 3 members of that property rights framework are equal members, and that making sure that legislation moving forward treats them all at the same level.
Great, Braeden, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me.